Most people, assume a kamikaze pilot carried nothing meant for survival. That assumption is wrong, and honestly, understanding why it's wrong reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how the final phase of the Pacific War actually functioned. These pilots were not sent aloft with empty hands and blind faith alone. They carried carefully chosen items that reflected contradiction, uncertainty, and a military system that really no longer fully believed its own propaganda. By late 1944, Japan was preparing young men for missions that officially allowed no return, yet quietly acknowledged the possibility of survival, capture, or prolonged suffering. That tension shaped what went into their emergency packs. And what those items tell us matters, not just for understanding Japan's war effort, but for understanding how institutions behave when collapse is already underway. If you value this kind of overlooked military history, consider subscribing early. Backyard Wisdom focuses on the details most summaries skip, and those details are often where the truth lives. Kamikaze missions were framed as absolute, but the system behind them was not. The popular image of the kamikaze pilot is one of total certainty and ideological purity. In reality, the program emerged out of desperation, not doctrine. By the time organized suicide attacks began, Japan had lost air superiority, fuel supplies were critically low, and pilot training had been shortened drastically. Kamikaze operations were a strategic admission that conventional air warfare was no longer sustainable. Yet, the military bureaucracy still functioned as a bureaucracy. Procedures existed, equipment lists existed, and emergency gear was still issued. The emergency pack reflected uncertainty more than fatalism. The contents of a kamikaze pilot's emergency pack varied slightly by unit and period, but records and surviving examples show some consistent themes. Pilots typically carried basic survival rations, often hard biscuits or rice-based food. Sometimes a small water container and occasionally medical items such as bandages or iodine. Some carried small tools like a knife or a compact signaling device. These were not symbolic objects, they were practical. Their presence acknowledges that aircraft could malfunction, targets could be missed, or pilots could be forced down before reaching their objective. Despite all the official rhetoric, the system quietly prepared for outcomes other than death. The presence of food is the most revealing detail. Food has no place in a mission where survival is impossible. And yet, it was there, often minimal, but present. This tells us two things. First, commanders understood that not every sortie would end as planned. Second, pilots themselves were expected to endure hardship even after failure. Some kamikaze pilots survived aborted missions and were reassigned, sometimes multiple times. Others crash-landed or ditched at sea and attempted to evade capture. The emergency rations were not generous, but they were enough to sustain a pilot briefly if stranded. Medical supplies suggest anticipation of injury, not martyrdom. Bandages, antiseptics, and basic first aid items appear in several documented packs. These were not ceremonial, they were standard issue for downed aircrew. Their inclusion reflects a system hedging its bets, even as it publicly insisted on absolute sacrifice. This contradiction really mattered psychologically. Pilots were told their role was to die, yet, at the same time, they were issued tools to survive. Weapons were sometimes included, but, not consistently. Some emergency kits included a small sidearm or maybe a knife. The purpose wasn't combat in a conventional sense. It was, instead, protection against capture, wild animals, or self-defense while evading enemy forces. This reflects another uncomfortable reality. The military anticipated scenarios in which pilots would live on after failure, possibly in hostile territory. This also ties into broader Japanese military attitudes toward capture. Survival gear did not imply acceptance of surrender. It implied avoidance, delay, and endurance under extreme conditions. Alongside standard gear, many pilots carried personal items not officially required. Photographs, letters, or, small religious objects were common. These were not unique to kamikaze pilots, but their presence here is often overlooked. These items remind us that the pilots were not abstract symbols. They were young men operating within a collapsing system. Often they found themselves carrying personal anchors into situations they could not fully control. By the late stages of the war, pilot training was drastically shortened. Many kamikaze pilots had only limited flight hours and, honestly, minimal survival training. Emergency packs were, at least in part, a bureaucratic response to that reality. If a pilot went down unexpectedly, there was little institutional support beyond what he carried. This has direct relevance to survival studies. When systems break down, responsibility shifts rapidly to the individual, whether or not that individual was prepared for it. The emergency pack exposes the gap between ideology and logistics. Ideology said death was assured. Logistics said otherwise. That gap is visible in the contents of the pack. It's a small but powerful example of how large systems behave under stress. They continue to prepare for contingencies, even when doctrine actually denies those contingencies exist. This pattern, well, it appears repeatedly in military history. Emergency procedures, interestingly, survive longer than official beliefs. Lessons for survival thinking, they come from what was prioritized, not really from what was said. From a survivalist perspective, the emergency pack teaches a quiet lesson. Even in a system built around sacrifice, the basics remained food, water, medical care, and simple tools. Not comfort, not heroism, function. The pack was not designed to ensure rescue. It was designed to extend endurance just long enough to matter. Understanding these details changes how we remember the kamikaze pilots. They were not simply weapons. They were airmen operating in a deteriorating war effort, equipped with contradictory instructions and limited resources. The emergency pack embodies that contradiction better than speeches or slogans ever could. Remembering this doesn't diminish their sacrifice, it humanizes it. And it forces us to confront how desperation reshapes decision-making at every level of war. Why these overlooked details still matter today. History is not just about outcomes, it's about systems under pressure and the small decisions that reveal their true priorities. The contents of a kamikaze pilot's emergency pack show us how even the most extreme military doctrines quietly hedge against reality. That insight matters for anyone interested in preparedness, institutional failure, or the human cost of strategic collapse. If you found value in examining this overlooked piece of history, consider subscribing to Backyard Wisdom and sharing this video. Remembering these details isn't about glorifying war. It's about understanding it clearly, so the lessons aren't lost to myth or simplification.